Hey guys, tonight we're wandering into one of the strangest corners of modern history. The story of how an entire country accidentally invented the drug delivery app before anyone invented food delivery apps. We're talking about Russia's so-called salt epidemic, a tale of cheap synthetic powders, encrypted marketplaces, and a delivery method so bizarre it makes your gym locker combination look secure. First, a genuine thank you to the listener who suggested this one. You send in the weirdest, most fascinating rabbit holes, and honestly, this channel only exists because you keep feeding it curiosity at odd hours. So if you enjoy these late-night history spirals, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is, because it is somehow always 20 past 2 in the morning somewhere. And by the way, we're now on Spotify too, so if you'd rather drift off with just your ears, the link is waiting patiently in the description. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft hum, and settle in. Let's pause for a moment and wonder, have you ever thought about what it would be like to order something forbidden and have it hidden behind a dumpster instead of dropped on your porch? Have you ever wondered how a drug named after bath products conquered a nation of 140 million people? Could you survive an economy where the strongest stimulant costs less than your morning coffee? Would you last a week in a city where the corner dealer had been quietly replaced by a website, a map pin, and a very nervous teenager in a hoodie? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in a grey Russian apartment block in the early 2010s. It is snowing. Your phone has more battery than your fridge has food. And somewhere below your window, buried under a loose paving stone, the 21st century is about to change how the whole world thinks about buying trouble. Good luck. Long before anyone whispered the word salt, Russia had already lived through several drug nightmares back to back. Let's talk about the years before our story really begins, because context is everything. And this context is bleak. In the 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed and the economy went into freefall, cheap heroin came flooding across the southern borders like an unwanted houseguest who never left. Then came the 2000s and the horror of homemade opioids so toxic they rotted people from the outside in. By the time our story starts, the average Russian city had already buried a generation. So when a new, cheap synthetic powder arrived, promising a cleaner, brighter, more affordable high, exhausted people didn't run away screaming. They leaned in, which, historically speaking, is exactly the moment things get interesting. Picture the backdrop for a second. Factories that once hummed through 3 shifts a day were standing quiet, their windows boarded, their workers scattered into a labour market that no longer wanted them. Whole towns had been built around a single industry, and when that industry evaporated, so did the sense that tomorrow would look anything like today. It's the kind of environment where despair doesn't announce itself with sirens. It just moves in slowly, like damp into a wall, until everyone in the building has quietly adjusted their expectations downward. Add in a healthcare system stretched thinner than old bedsheets, and you have fertile ground for anything that promises relief, no matter how temporary or synthetic that relief happens to be. What made this particular moment different wasn't the presence of addiction, which had unfortunately always found a way in. It was the shape addiction was about to take. Previous waves had been almost entirely physical: a needle, a vein, a slow and visible decline that neighbours could see happening on a park bench. The chemicals arriving next would be different in one crucial way. They wouldn't just hollow people out. They'd rewire how those people interacted with the world around them, trading visible collapse for something quieter, twitchier, and far harder to spot from across the street. Nobody involved understood this yet. They just knew the old drugs were getting harder to find and considerably more expensive, and human ingenuity, for better or almost always worse, abhors an unmet demand. There's also the simple matter of boredom, which doesn't get discussed nearly enough in stories like this. In towns where the factory is closed and the promised prosperity of a new market economy has stubbornly failed to arrive, evenings stretch long and options stay short. Television offered escape for a few hours. Vodka offered escape for a few more. But a whole generation of young people, raised on stories of Soviet stability that had evaporated before they'd finished growing up, were hungry for something that felt new, felt modern, felt like it belonged to them rather than to their parents' broken promises. That hunger, as it turns out, is exactly the kind of vacancy a clever chemist halfway across the continent is only too happy to fill. Consider for a moment the specific chemical disaster that immediately preceded our story, because it set the emotional baseline for everything that followed. In the 2000s, a homemade opioid cooked up from cheap codeine tablets and household solvents swept through poorer neighborhoods, earning a nickname borrowed from its scaly, blackened effect on the skin of long-term users. It was cheap, it was grotesque, and it killed with a speed that shocked even hardened addiction workers. By the time that particular horror had run its course, an entire generation of Russian families had already learned the hardest possible way that cheap and homemade did not mean safe, and yet, exhausted by grief rather than immunized against it, they were about to meet an entirely new chemical family with a considerably gentler sounding name. And so the stage was set with all the ingredients this genre loves: economic desperation, institutional exhaustion, a population primed by prior chemical disasters to treat a new option as merely the next chapter rather than a fresh horror, and a technological moment right on the horizon that nobody in that freezing apartment block could possibly have predicted. The old drugs were fading. The new one hadn't arrived yet, and somewhere in a laboratory that had nothing to do with recreational use at all, a compound first written down decades earlier was about to get a very unwelcome second life. Let's clear something up immediately, because the name is deeply misleading. When Russians started talking about sol, meaning salt, they were not seasoning their potatoes. Salt became the street nickname for a family of lab-made stimulants called synthetic cathinones, chemical cousins of a plant stimulant found in an East African shrub. The powders looked innocent, sometimes crystalline, sometimes dusty, and they picked up cosy little nicknames the way stray cats pick up fleas. In the West, they'd been marketed with the almost adorable label of bath salts, sold in shops as things definitely not meant for humans. Wink wink. In Russia, the name stuck harder and darker. Salt sounded harmless, domestic, sitting right there in your kitchen cupboard. That was precisely the problem. The plant these chemicals were distantly related to had been chewed for centuries in parts of East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula for a mild, coffee-like lift. Nothing about that leaf ever suggested it would spawn a laboratory arms race. But chemists, being chemists, took the basic molecular skeleton and started bolting new pieces onto it, the way a determined child might modify a bicycle until it barely resembles a bicycle anymore. Small tweaks to that skeleton produced entirely different personalities of drug, some closer to a stimulant, some closer to something that felt more like ecstasy, some so aggressive they belonged in their own separate category of concern entirely. What made these powders genuinely sneaky was how forgettable they looked. Picture a small plastic bag of white or slightly off-white powder, the kind of thing you might mistake for laundry detergent samples, or a packet of instant soup base if you weren't paying attention. There was no obvious menace to it, no dramatic packaging, no skull and crossbones. Just a quiet little pouch that could just as easily have held bath salts for a Sunday soak, which is of course exactly the joke the marketers were making when they first labelled the stuff for sale in the West. Humour as camouflage, which is a genuinely clever trick right up until people start dying from the punchline. And because these were synthesized in laboratories rather than grown in fields, the variety was almost limitless. Change one molecular branch, and you had a slightly different chemical, often still legal for a window of time before regulators caught up and wrote a new law specifically banning that one configuration. This created an odd game of whack-a-mole where chemists, some legitimate, most decidedly not, kept a half step ahead of legislation simply by tweaking the recipe. Salt wasn't one drug. It was a whole shifting family of drugs wearing the same disguise, and that flexibility would prove to be one of its most stubborn features in the years to come. The naming didn't stop at salt either. Every region seemed to develop its own small dialect of nicknames, the way a secret handshake evolves separately in every corner of a large family. Some circles called it a mix, hinting vaguely at its blended chemical origins. Others leaned on the domestic theme entirely, treating it as a kind of household code word that meant nothing to an outsider and everything to a buyer. This linguistic camouflage served a genuinely practical purpose beyond mere cuteness. A conversation about salt could pass entirely unnoticed by a suspicious parent, a nosy neighbour, or an eavesdropping stranger on public transport, because the words themselves carried no obvious red flag. It's the pharmacological equivalent of hiding in plain sight, dressed in the borrowed vocabulary of a spice rack. For the person actually buying it on a cold street corner, none of this chemistry mattered in the moment. What mattered was that it was cheap, it was available, and it promised to make a Grey Tuesday feel like something else entirely. The name salt gave it a friendly domestic sheen that helped an entire population underestimate exactly what they were holding in their palm. Chemistry rarely bothers with branding, but this particular substance got lucky, or rather, everyone around it got unlucky, with a name that sounded like something from the pantry rather than something that could quietly dismantle a person from the inside. To understand how salt reached Russia, we first have to take a short, awkward detour to the United Kingdom, where this whole mess got its modern start. Around 2007, a stimulant called Mephedrone, affectionately nicknamed Meow Meow by people who clearly named it before trying it, exploded across British nightclubs. It was legal, it was cheap, and for a brief shining window you could order it online with the same casual energy as buying phone chargers. British authorities panicked, banned it in 2010, and assumed the story was over. It was not over. Bans don't delete a recipe, they just relocate the party. And the party, it turned out, was about to catch a very long flight east. The molecule itself was nothing new. It had first been written down by chemists decades earlier, tucked away in academic journals that nobody outside a laboratory would ever read for fun. For most of the 20th century it sat there, a forgotten footnote, the chemical equivalent of an unpublished manuscript gathering dust in a drawer. Then the internet happened, and suddenly obscure academic footnotes became searchable, shareable, and crucially, orderable. A handful of enterprising chemists rediscovered the recipe, realized it produced effects loosely comparable to ecstasy and cocaine, and started manufacturing it at scale, marketing it under names playful enough to disguise exactly how serious the consequences could be. British club culture, always hungry for the next thing, adopted it with startling speed. It was sold in little plastic tubs labelled as plant food, a fig leaf so thin that everyone involved, buyers and sellers alike, treated it as an open joke. Nobody was fertilising anything with it. Headlines followed, then hospitalisations, then the inevitable parliamentary hand-wringing, and by April of 2010 the substance was formally outlawed across the country. Case closed, tidy ending, chemical villain defeated. Except illegal drugs, much like water, simply find a new path downhill the moment you block the old one. Club-goers who tried it in those early British years described a rush somewhere between a roller coaster and a caffeine overdose. a burst of sociability and energy that made a crowded, sweaty dance floor feel briefly like the center of the universe. It was cheaper than the drugs it was mimicking, easier to order than finding a dealer, and for a while it carried none of the criminal stigma that clung to cocaine or ecstasy, since technically, on paper, it wasn't illegal at all. That combination, cheap, legal, and fun, is about as close to a perfect storm as recreational chemistry ever produces. Of course, perfect storms rarely stay contained to the dance floor that summoned them, and this one was no exception, spreading through word of mouth and online forums with the same enthusiasm usually reserved for a genuinely good song. What British lawmakers hadn't quite reckoned with was the borderless nature of the recipe itself. You cannot uninvent a chemical formula any more than you can uninvent a song once it's been hummed in public. The knowledge of how to make mephedrone and its many chemical cousins was already scattered across forums, chat logs, and the private notebooks of chemists who had no particular loyalty to the United Kingdom's legal calendar. Ban it in one country, and production simply shrugs and relocates to wherever the laws haven't caught up yet, or wherever nobody's looking terribly hard in the first place. And so, quietly, almost accidentally, a substance born in British nightclubs began drifting east, following the same logic that has guided contraband since the dawn of trade routes: go where the demand is highest and the enforcement is thinnest. Eastern Europe, and Russia in particular, would soon prove to be extraordinarily fertile ground for exactly that combination. The United Kingdom had built the door. Nobody there intended for anyone else to walk through it, but doors, once opened, rarely stay confined to the room they were built for. So mephedrone gets banned across Western Europe and quietly boards the metaphorical train to the largest country on Earth. Let's talk about why Russia rolled out the red carpet without meaning to. Real cocaine was absurdly expensive, having travelled halfway around the planet. Quality methamphetamine wasn't cheap either. Into this gap stepped a stimulant that could be produced almost anywhere, cost a rounding error to make, and delivered a similar rush for pocket change. When you're broke, cold, and the imported luxury drug cost a week's wages while the local knockoff costs a sandwich, economics quietly makes the decision for you. Russia didn't choose salt so much as salt filled the exact hole the market had left open. Consider the sheer geography involved. Cocaine has to cross an ocean, change hands a dozen times, and survive customs checkpoints staffed by people whose entire job is to notice exactly this kind of cargo. Every one of those steps adds risk, and every risk gets priced into the final product, which is why a gram in a European capital can cost more than a week's groceries. Mephedrone and its relatives needed none of that theatre. The precursor chemicals were unglamorous, widely available industrial ingredients, the kind of thing that raises no eyebrows on a shipping manifest. A modest laboratory, sometimes barely more than a converted apartment or garage, could turn those precursors into finished product without ever touching a border crossing. This meant the entire cost structure of the drug trade flipped on its head. Instead of a product that got more expensive the closer you moved it, you had a product that got cheaper the more locally you made it, because you'd cut out every single link in that long, risky, expensive international supply chain. Domestic production doesn't just save money, it removes almost all of the friction that normally slows a drug trade down. No customs agents to bribe, no smuggling routes to protect, no international cartel middlemen taking their cut. Just a chemist, a formula, and a country large enough that any single production site could vanish into the landscape without much trouble. And Russia, geographically, is almost aggressively large. A laboratory tucked somewhere in a provincial industrial zone had thousands of square miles of anonymity working in its favour. Enforcement resources that might comfortably cover a small European nation gets stretched thin and pale across a landmass spanning 11 time zones. It's not that Russian law enforcement lacked capability, it's that the sheer scale of the territory made a whack-a-mole approach to lab busts almost mathematically hopeless. Shut one down, and another quietly starts up 1,000 miles away, using the same recipe, the same cheap ingredients, and the same eager market waiting on the other end. Compare for a second the production complexity of importing cocaine against the production complexity of cooking up a batch of synthetic cathinones domestically. Cocaine requires a specific crop, grown in a specific climate, harvested by specific labour, processed through a specific chain of specialised handlers before it ever leaves its country of origin. Every one of those steps is a potential choke point for law enforcement, a fixed geographic location that can eventually be mapped, monitored, and disrupted. A synthetic stimulant lab needs none of that fixed geography. It needs a room, a ventilation fan, some basic glassware, and a chemist willing to follow a recipe. That difference in structural complexity explains, almost entirely on its own, why one drug stayed expensive and rare while the other became cheap and everywhere almost overnight. Layer onto all of this a population already primed by economic hardship to want a cheap escape, and you have every ingredient necessary for exactly the kind of epidemic that was about to unfold. It wasn't inevitable in some mystical sense. It was closer to simple arithmetic. A country with the geography to hide production, the economic conditions to guarantee demand, and a chemical recipe with almost no barrier to entry. Salt didn't conquer Russia through some elaborate criminal masterstroke. It arrived because every door that should have been locked happened, for one reason or another, to be standing open. Let's linger on the money for a moment, because the numbers are genuinely staggering and explain almost everything that follows. On the online markets, a gram of Mephedrone reportedly started around $25, while a gram of cocaine started closer to $130. Journalists investigating the trade heard whispers that the raw production cost of some of these powders could drop to mere cents per gram. Cents. That's the kind of profit margin that makes legitimate businesses weep into their spreadsheets. When something is that cheap to make and that expensive to buy, you don't get a drug problem. You get an industry, complete with logistics, marketing, and a customer service department. Yes, really, we'll get there. Try to sit with that markup for a second because it's almost cartoonishly large. Imagine buying a raw ingredient for the price of a stick of gum and reselling the finished product for the price of a modest dinner out. Multiply that transaction by thousands of buyers across a country of 140 million people, and you begin to understand why so many otherwise ordinary people, students, underemployed factory workers, bored teenagers with a chemistry set and poor judgment, found themselves drawn toward manufacturing rather than merely consuming. The barrier to entry wasn't expertise. It was closer to a decent internet connection and a willingness to ignore some fairly obvious legal and moral warning signs. Compare this to the traditional drug trade, which for most of history required serious capital, serious connections, and a serious tolerance for violence. Moving cocaine across a continent means dealing with cartels, corrupt officials, and men who solve business disputes with considerably more finality than a strongly worded email. Synthetic cathinone production required none of that infrastructure. A person with basic chemistry knowledge, a modest workspace, and access to unregulated precursor chemicals could set up shop without ever encountering a single cartel enforcer. The violence that had defined the drug trade for generations was, in this particular corner of it, largely optional. This economic accessibility didn't just lower prices for buyers, it democratized the entire supply side of the business in a way that older drugs never managed. cocaine production is concentrated in a handful of regions blessed, or cursed, with the right climate for coca cultivation. Synthetic cathinone production could happen literally anywhere with a working stove and a chemistry textbook. That geographic flexibility meant supply could pop up faster than enforcement could track it, and it meant the profit motive extended down to a level of society that traditional cartels never bothered recruiting from: the bored, the broke, and the merely curious. Try, for a moment, to picture the actual math laid out on a kitchen table. A batch of precursor chemicals costing a modest sum could, once processed, be divided into hundreds of individual gram-sized packages, each one sold for many, many times the original per-unit cost. It's the kind of markup that would make a legitimate retailer blush, the sort of margin usually reserved for concert tickets or overpriced airport sandwiches, except applied here to something that could unravel a person's nervous system. Nobody needed a business degree to notice that math. They just needed a working stove, a bit of chemistry knowledge scraped together from online forums, and a willingness to look past exactly where that profit was actually coming from. What you end up with, then, isn't a drug trade in the classic Hollywood sense of shadowy kingpins and dramatic shootouts. It's something closer to an unregulated cottage industry, scattered, decentralized, and terrifyingly cheap to enter. Despair, it turns out, makes for a remarkably efficient market. When the cost of making misery this profitable drops low enough, plenty of people who never imagined themselves as drug manufacturers found the math simply too tempting to ignore. And once the money started flowing, the delivery system needed to match. It was about to get a lot stranger than a simple street corner exchange. Before we marvel at the new system, let's mourn the old one, in the way you might mourn a rotary phone. For most of history, buying illegal drugs meant meeting a shady person, in a shady place, at a shady hour, exchanging money for a small bag while both parties tried very hard to look casual. It was dangerous for everyone involved. The buyer risked robbery, the seller risked arrest, and both risked bumping into someone's disapproving aunt from church. This face-to-face model had survived for centuries because there was simply no alternative. Then technology arrived, as it always does, promising to make an inconvenient thing horrifyingly convenient. Think about everything that had to align for an old-fashioned transaction to succeed. The buyer needed to know where to go, which usually meant knowing someone who knew someone, a fragile chain of trust that could snap to any weak link. The seller needed to trust that the person approaching them wasn't secretly wearing a wire, which in a climate of constant suspicion made every transaction feel like a small, tense negotiation with an undercover officer who probably wasn't there but definitely might be. Every meeting was a tiny gamble stacked on top of another tiny gamble, repeated daily by people who had, by that point, simply gotten used to the background hum of risk. And then there was the sheer inefficiency of it all. A dealer could only physically be in one place at a time, could only carry so much product before the bulge in a coat pocket became conspicuous, and could only serve so many customers before attracting the kind of neighborhood attention that eventually finds its way to a police report. It was a business model with a hard ceiling on how large it could ever realistically grow, constrained by the very human limitations of showing up somewhere in person and hoping nobody was watching too closely. There was also, let's be honest, a real physical danger baked into every single exchange. Robbery was common. A buyer with cash and a seller with product make for an appealing target on both sides of the transaction. Violence simmered just beneath the surface of an industry that had no access to courts, contracts, or customer service lines to resolve a dispute. If a deal went wrong, there was no polite way to file a complaint. You simply absorbed the loss, or worse, and moved on to the next shady corner at the next shady hour, hoping for better luck. Trust in this old system had to be built entirely through word of mouth. A slow, fragile chain of introductions where one wrong recommendation could land you face to face with an undercover officer instead of an actual dealer. A newcomer to any city effectively had to start from zero, rebuilding an entire social network of trust from scratch before they could reliably buy anything at all. This made the whole system remarkably inefficient at scale, since expanding into a new neighbourhood meant painstakingly re-earning the same trust that had already been built, brick by brick, somewhere else entirely. It was a business model perpetually starting over, forever rebuilding the same fragile foundation in every new corner it tried to reach. This was the system that had persisted, largely unchanged in its fundamentals, for as long as prohibition itself had existed. It was clunky, it was dangerous, and it placed a hard limit on how large any single operation could grow before the physical logistics of showing up in person collapsed under their own weight. Somewhere, though, a new idea was quietly forming, one that would strip away nearly every one of these old vulnerabilities by removing the single most dangerous variable in the entire equation, the moment when two people actually had to stand in the same place at the same time. Here's where the story takes its first deliciously ironic turn. In many countries, online drug dealers simply mailed their products, hidden inside packages that looked like ordinary parcels. Russia's dealers did this too for a while. Then lawmakers, trying to be clever, passed rules pushing the postal service to inspect packages for illegal substances, sensible on paper, catastrophic in practice. Because instead of stopping the trade, it simply convinced dealers to abandon the mail entirely and invent something new, something that never touched a post office, never crossed a border checkpoint, and never left a paper trail. The authorities had accidentally handed the entire industry a reason to become far, far harder to catch. Well done, everyone. Understand what mail had actually offered before this law arrived. A package sent through the postal system could travel enormous distances anonymously, arriving at a doorstep with all the innocence of a birthday card. Dealers disguised their shipments inside everyday objects, hollowed out books, resealed snack packaging, the sort of low-effort camouflage that worked precisely because postal workers process an overwhelming volume of parcels daily and simply cannot inspect each one with the scrutiny of a customs agent at an international border. For a while, this was a comfortable, low-risk channel, letting the whole operation function with a postage stamp's worth of effort. Then the law changed, requiring postal workers to actively screen for illicit contents, and the comfortable channel evaporated almost overnight. Suddenly, every parcel became a potential liability. A single flagged package could unravel an entire supply chain, tracing backward through sender addresses and forward through recipient records, exposing links in the business that had never needed to be visible before. For an industry built on staying invisible, this was an existential threat, not a minor inconvenience. And when an entire business model suddenly faces existential threat, it doesn't shut down. It innovates, usually faster and more creatively than anyone regulating it expected. What lawmakers seemed not to have fully appreciated is a pattern that repeats endlessly throughout the history of prohibition. Criminal enterprises treat legal obstacles the way water treats a dam, not as a stopping point, but as an invitation to find the nearest crack and pour through it. Close one channel, and pressure simply redirects toward whichever channel remains open. In this case, the channel that remained open was physical space itself, the actual streets, courtyards, and hidden corners of Russian cities, which no law could inspect the way a postal worker could inspect a parcel. Picture the mechanics of that new inspection regime for a moment, because the mundane bureaucratic detail is exactly where this story gets interesting. postal workers, suddenly tasked with flagging suspicious parcels, had to be trained to notice inconsistencies in weight, unusual packaging, or telltale odours, turning ordinary sorting facilities into makeshift checkpoints. For a network built on cheap, disposable, anonymous shipping, this new layer of scrutiny functioned less like a speed bump and more like a wall dropped directly across the only road the entire business had ever used. Dealers who had once relied on the sheer overwhelming volume of the mail system to hide their shipments in plain sight suddenly found every single parcel treated as a potential liability, and liabilities, in this line of work, tend to get abandoned very quickly. And so, almost as a direct and immediate consequence of a law meant to choke off the drug trade, an entirely new distribution method was born, one that would prove far more resilient, far more scalable, and far harder to dismantle than the mail ever was. It's a genuinely remarkable case study in unintended consequences, the kind economists write papers about, and regulators quietly hope nobody brings up at dinner parties. The postal crackdown didn't end anything. It simply cleared the runway for something considerably stranger to take off, something that would, within a remarkably short span of years, dwarf whatever modest mail-order operation it had originally replaced. And so we arrive at the strange centerpiece of our whole story, a delivery method the Russians called clad, meaning treasure. The concept was grimly simple. Nobody would meet anybody. Instead, a courier would stash a small package somewhere in a city, behind a loose brick, under a bench, tucked into the snow at the base of a lamppost, and record roughly where it was. The buyer, having paid online, would receive a location and go find it, like the world's bleakest scavenger hunt. No handshake, no eye contact, no awkward small talk. Two people could complete a transaction while never once existing in the same place at the same time. It was, and there's no comfortable way to say this, an innovation. Consider the elegant, unsettling logic of it. Every weakness of the old face-to-face system, the risk of robbery, the risk of arrest during a handoff, the risk of an undercover officer posing as either buyer or seller, disappeared the instant human contact was removed from the equation. The courier hid the package hours, sometimes days, before the buyer ever arrived to collect it. By the time anyone showed up to retrieve their treasure, the person who had hidden it was long gone, blended back into the anonymous churn of the city, impossible to connect to the transaction unless someone happened to catch the burial itself on camera. Buyers received their coordinates the way you might receive directions to a surprise party, a rough description, a nearby landmark, sometimes a small photograph of the hiding spot itself. Then off they went, wandering courtyards and alleyways at odd hours, crouching behind dumpsters with the studied casualness of someone who has definitely dropped their car keys and is definitely not doing anything else. It's a strange mental image, an entire nation's drug trade reduced to grown adults quietly digging through frozen shrubbery in search of a small parcel that a stranger left there earlier that same day. What made this system so much more dangerous, ironically, than the one it replaced, was precisely how well it worked. Removing the human handoff didn't just reduce risk for the criminals involved, it also removed the last natural friction point that might have given a hesitant buyer pause. There was no awkward face-to-face moment where a nervous first-timer might lose their nerve and walk away. There was just a map, a search, and a small triumphant discovery, gamified in a way that made every purchase feel a little like winning, rather than something to feel any shame about at all. There's a strange, almost childlike quality to the vocabulary that grew up around this system, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Calling a hidden package treasure, complete with its own dedicated slang and its own quiet culture of tips and tricks for finding a well-hidden drop, transformed something genuinely dangerous into something that borrowed the language of a game. buyers described the small thrill of locating their parcel successfully, the little dopamine hit of a scavenger hunt completed, layered right on top of whatever chemical high was coming next. It's a genuinely unsettling bit of psychological engineering, whether anyone designed it on purpose or not, dressing a serious crime in the comforting costume of a treasure map. This delivery innovation didn't stay small or experimental for long. It scaled with a speed that surprised even the people who built it, because it turned out to solve nearly every logistical headache that had plagued the drug trade since its inception. No wonder, then, that within a few short years, this quiet game of buried treasure would become the backbone of an online marketplace larger than almost anyone could have imagined, one that would eventually need an entire supporting cast of couriers, websites and payment systems just to keep the treasure flowing. Every empire has a scrappy predecessor that gets forgotten, and Russia's online drug empire was no different. Before the giant we'll soon meet, there was a marketplace known as Ramp, quietly humming away on the hidden part of the internet reachable only through special anonymizing software. Ramp proved the model worked. It showed that buyers would trust a website, that sellers would follow rules, and that this bizarre treasure hunt delivery system could scale up beyond a handful of desperate transactions into something resembling a functioning economy. Ramp eventually fell to police in 2017, but by then the idea was out of the bottle and refusing to go back in. Someone bigger was already waiting in the wings. Ramp's genius, such as it was, lay in structure rather than invention. The dead drop delivery method already existed in scattered informal versions before Ramp arrived, but Ramp was the first to wrap that method inside something that felt organized, almost professional. It offered a centralized place where sellers could list their goods, where buyers could browse options the way you might browse an online catalog, and where a rudimentary sense of order replaced the chaotic word-of-mouth nature of earlier drug commerce. For the first time, buying illegal drugs in Russia started to resemble online shopping rather than a nervous back-alley negotiation. This mattered enormously for trust, which is the scarcest resource in any illegal marketplace. When you cannot sue someone for selling you a fake product, and you certainly cannot call the police to report that your illegal purchase was disappointing, some other mechanism has to fill that gap. Ramp began experimenting with the tools that would later define the entire genre: seller listings, basic feedback mechanisms, a sense that misbehavior carried consequences even in a lawless corner of the internet. It was primitive compared to what came later, but every complex system starts as a primitive one, fumbling toward the features that will eventually make it indispensable. For years, Ramp operated with the kind of quiet momentum that draws little outside attention, until suddenly it draws quite a lot. It built a loyal user base, established trusted vendor relationships, and effectively normalized an entire generation of Russian drug buyers to the idea that this was simply how you acquired what you wanted now. Online, anonymously, with a buried package waiting somewhere in the city rather than a person waiting on a corner. That normalization was arguably Ramp's most lasting contribution, more significant even than the technical infrastructure it built. Ramp's eventual collapse in 2017 came at the hands of Russian police, one of the relatively rare moments in this entire saga where domestic law enforcement actually landed a decisive blow against the platform itself, rather than merely arresting couriers further down the chain. For a brief window, this looked like a genuine victory, proof that the authorities could, when sufficiently motivated, take down even a well-established criminal marketplace. What nobody fully appreciated at the time was that Ramp's downfall wouldn't shrink the overall market so much as consolidate it, clearing the field for whichever competitor could move quickest to absorb the sudden flood of displaced still eager customers. When Russian police finally shut Ramp down in 2017, headlines briefly celebrated a victory against organised cybercrime. But the shutdown didn't erase the model Ramp had proven. It simply created a vacancy at the top of an ecosystem that had already learned to exist. Users didn't disappear. They migrated almost immediately toward whatever platform could absorb them next. And one platform, already growing quietly in the background, was more than ready to take the crown. History, it turns out, rarely leaves a vacuum for long, especially one this profitable. And whatever filled it next would need to be considerably more ambitious than a single scrappy predecessor ever managed to be. A lesson the next platform seemed to have absorbed almost immediately. In 2015, two existing operations merged and gave birth to a platform whose name would come to define an entire era: Hydra. Named, presumably, after the mythical beast that grew two heads for every one you chopped off, which is either an ominous warning or excellent branding depending on your outlook. Hydra swallowed its competition, absorbed Ramp's collapse, and grew without any serious rival to slow it down. Within a few short years, it wasn't just a website, it was the beating, encrypted heart of the Russian drug trade. And unlike its short-lived cousins around the world, which usually got busted within a year, Hydra would endure for an astonishing 7. Longevity, it turns out, is how you become a legend and a warning at the same time. The merger that created Hydra combined the technical know-how of one operation with the market reach of another, producing something considerably more sophisticated than either predecessor had managed alone. From nearly its first days, Hydra treated itself less like a shady bazaar and more like a serious platform, investing in the kind of infrastructure that legitimate startups obsess over: uptime, user experience, dispute resolution, trust mechanisms. It's a bizarre thing to say about a criminal marketplace, but Hydra's early operators seemed to genuinely understand that the platform which felt most reliable would eventually crush every competitor that didn't bother with the same discipline. When Ramp finally collapsed under police pressure in 2017, Hydra was perfectly positioned to inherit the orphaned user base, and it did so with startling efficiency. Displaced buyers and sellers didn't need to learn an entirely new system from scratch. They simply migrated their habits, their expectations, and eventually their loyalty toward the one remaining giant standing in the ashes of its rival. Within what felt like months rather than years, Hydra had absorbed enough of the old ecosystem to functionally become the only game in town, a monopoly built not through violence, but through sheer operational competence. What's remarkable looking back is how little serious resistance Hydra faced during this critical growth period. Competitors that tried to rise alongside it found themselves squeezed out, sometimes through pricing pressure, sometimes through Hydra's own internal rules, forbidding vendors from operating on rival platforms simultaneously. It was, in its own grim way, an aggressive business strategy, not unlike how a dominant retailer might pressure suppliers into exclusivity deals. Except here, the product being distributed exclusively wasn't running shoes or electronics. It was a nation's supply of synthetic stimulants, funneled increasingly through one single, unblinking digital choke point. There's something worth noting about the choice of a mythological monster as a brand name, even if it was likely chosen half in jest by whoever registered the platform's first domain. Names carry expectations, and a name built around relentless regeneration set a strange, almost prophetic tone for everything that would follow over the platform's improbably long lifespan. Every time a rival tried to chip away at its market share, every time a courier got arrested and a supply route briefly stumbled, the platform simply absorbed the disruption and kept growing, as if daring anyone watching to take the metaphor seriously. Few at the time did. By the time most ordinary Russians had even heard whispers of Hydra's existence, it had already become something close to inevitable, an infrastructure as embedded in certain corners of daily life as any legitimate delivery service. 7 years is an eternity in the world of illegal online marketplaces, most of which flame out within months under the weight of police pressure or their own operators' greed. Hydra would manage something almost unheard of: sustained, expanding dominance, year after year, quietly becoming larger than anyone outside a small circle of researchers and investigators fully understood. Empires built on secrecy rarely announce their own coronation, and this one certainly never bothered to. Let's talk about what made Hydra genuinely different, because calling it a drug website is like calling a shopping mall a shop. Hydra became a full economy. It had customer reviews, star ratings, and lengthy written testimonials where buyers described their experiences in unsettling detail. It had escrow, meaning your money was held safely until you confirmed delivery, protecting you from getting scammed by the person selling you illegal powder. Let that sink in. There was better buyer protection on the illegal drug marketplace than on some legitimate websites. There were dispute resolution systems, wholesale sections, and a customer-based numbering in the millions. It was e-commerce with all the trimmings, just pointed in the worst possible direction. The escrow system alone deserves a moment of genuine, if uncomfortable, admiration for its cleverness. In any transaction where trust is scarce, someone eventually has to solve the problem of what happens if one party simply doesn't hold up their end of the bargain. Legitimate businesses solve this with contracts, courts, and credit card chargebacks. Hydra solved it by holding the buyer's payment in a kind of digital vault until the buyer confirmed the package had actually been found and matched what was advertised. Only then would funds release to the seller. It was, functionally, the exact same protection mechanism that legitimate online marketplaces use, repurposed entirely for contraband. Layered on top of escrow was a review system that would look eerily familiar to anyone who has ever shopped online. Vendors accumulated ratings and reputations over time, and buyers browsed those reputations before choosing where to spend their money, exactly the way you might check reviews before booking a hotel room. A vendor with consistently strong feedback could charge a small premium, trading on trust the same way any legitimate brand does. A vendor who scammed one customer too many would watch their reputation collapse, their sales dry up, and their entire operation effectively die from the same market forces that punish bad service anywhere else. There were wholesale sections for buyers looking to purchase in bulk, dispute resolution processes for handling disagreements between vendors and customers, and a sprawling forum culture where users traded tips, complained about slow couriers, and occasionally offered each other genuine harm reduction advice buried among the commercial chatter. All of this infrastructure required constant technical maintenance, moderation, and investment, resources that Hydra's operators poured in with a seriousness that mirrored any successful startup, minus the part where their entire product line was federally illegal. Beyond the storefront itself, there was even a kind of customer support culture, complete with lengthy forum threads where users troubleshot failed deliveries, compared notes on which regions had the most reliable couriers, and occasionally offered each other genuinely earnest advice about dosage or safety. Moderators, unpaid or paid in ways that were never entirely clear, kept order among the chaos, settling disputes, and occasionally banning vendors whose behavior threatened the platform's carefully cultivated reputation for reliability. It's the exact same infrastructure you'd expect from any large online community, built around a shared, if unusual, interest. Except the shared interest here happened to be one that could genuinely ruin a life. The unsettling truth at the center of all this is that criminal enterprises, when given enough scale and enough time, tend to reinvent the exact same structures that legitimate commerce relies on, because those structures exist for good reasons that apply regardless of what's actually being sold. Trust needs to be built, disputes need resolving, money needs protecting. Hydra didn't invent new rules of commerce, it simply proved, on a massive and troubling scale, that those rules work just as well when the product being moved is something that could destroy the person buying it. Commerce, it turns out, doesn't ask what it's selling before it starts optimizing how to sell it. Of all Hydra's features, the review system might be the most quietly disturbing, so naturally we're going to talk about it. Just as you might rate a restaurant or a pair of headphones, buyers rated their dead drop experiences and their sellers. Researchers who later studied the site found that the star ratings were nearly useless. Almost everyone gave the maximum score, but the written reviews told the real story. People described whether the hidden package was easy to find, whether the product matched the description, whether the courier had done a competent job burying their treasure. It was the gig economy's rating culture applied to something genuinely dangerous, and it worked exactly as well as it did for pizza. Which is the horrifying part. Sit with the strange normalcy of these written reviews for a moment. Users didn't write in the shorthand of hardened criminals. They wrote the way anyone writes an online review, with the same small grievances and small praises you'd expect from someone rating a mediocre restaurant delivery. Complaints about a package buried too shallowly, praise for a courier who included clear photographic directions, mild disappointment about a slightly smaller quantity than advertised. Read out of context, entire passages could have come from any consumer review site on the ordinary internet, which is precisely what made them so unsettling to researchers poring through the data afterward. The star ratings, as it turned out, carried almost no useful information at all, because nearly every transaction that generated a review scored at or near the maximum. This mirrors a well-documented quirk of online review culture generally. People who bother leaving a rating tend to skew positive, since deeply dissatisfied customers are more likely to simply vanish and complain elsewhere rather than formally document their displeasure within the platform itself. What actually mattered, researchers discovered, was buried in the text of the reviews themselves, the specific language people used to describe their experience, which carried far richer signal than any star count ever could. This meant that savvy buyers learned to read past the numbers entirely, scanning written feedback the way a careful shopper might skip past a suspiciously perfect 5-star average and dig into the actual comments underneath. A seller could accumulate glowing star ratings while still betraying subtle red flags buried in customer language, inconsistent quality, slow response times, the occasional buried complaint softened by politeness. It turned buying illegal drugs into an exercise in the exact same kind of consumer literacy required to navigate any crowded online marketplace, a genuinely bizarre skill transfer between two worlds that should have nothing in common. Picture the actual texture of these written reviews for a second, because the banality is what makes them so haunting. A buyer might note that the location was described a little vaguely, and took an extra 10 minutes of searching in the cold, or praise a vendor for including a clear photograph that made the drop easy to spot on the first try. Another might mention that the product arrived slightly underweight, gently suggesting the vendor double-check their scale next time, phrased with the same mild, constructive annoyance you'd use complaining about a slow food delivery. Nothing about the language itself hinted at the stakes involved. That, more than almost any other detail in this whole story, is what makes the review culture so quietly disturbing to read after the fact. Perhaps the most sobering part of all this is what it reveals about human behaviour under strange circumstances. Even in a marketplace built entirely around illegal, dangerous transactions, people still reached instinctively for the familiar rituals of ordinary commerce, rating, reviewing, comparing notes with strangers. The impulse to leave feedback runs so deep in modern consumer culture that it followed people even into the most illicit corner of the internet imaginable, transforming a genuinely dark industry into something that, on the page at least, looked disturbingly like leaving a review for a mediocre pizza delivery on a Tuesday night. Now we meet the human being at the bottom of this entire pyramid, the person who actually hid the packages, the courier or cladman. These weren't kingpins in white suits. They were often young, frequently broke, sometimes barely out of school, lured by promises of easy money for a few hours of walking around town hiding little parcels. What they weren't always told was that the courier was the single most arrestable link in the whole chain, the one part of the invisible machine that had to physically exist in the real world, out in the cold, on camera, leaving footprints in the snow. The bosses stayed hidden behind screens. The kids took all the risk. It's an old, ugly story wearing a new digital coat. Recruitment for these positions rarely looked like a shadowy back-alley approach. More often it resembled an ordinary online job posting, promising flexible hours, decent pay, and minimal explanation of exactly what the work entailed, until the recruit was already curious enough to ask follow-up questions. By the time the actual nature of the job became clear, many recruits had already invested enough interest or desperation that turning back felt harder than simply proceeding. This is a recruitment pattern uncomfortably familiar from other forms of exploitative labour throughout history, dressed up in the modern language of gig work and flexible scheduling. Once recruited, a cladman's daily routine involved receiving instructions remotely, a list of locations to visit, quantities to distribute, hiding spots to document with a quick photograph for the eventual buyer. The work demanded a strange combination of skills, enough street smarts to identify a hiding spot that was discreet but findable, enough patience to wait out foot traffic before making a move, and enough nerve to repeat the entire process dozens of times across a single freezing shift. It was physically exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with heavy lifting and everything to do with the low, constant hum of anxiety that comes from knowing any passerby could be an undercover officer. The financial arithmetic of the job rarely worked out favourably once you accounted for the actual risk involved. Yes, the pay-per-completed drop might sound reasonable on paper, but multiply the hours spent trudging through courtyards against the very real possibility of a multi-year prison sentence, and the hourly rate collapses under scrutiny. Researchers who later studied the economics of platforms like Hydra found that courier costs made up a startling share of the final retail price, sometimes exceeding half the total cost of a single dead drop. The treasure hunt buyers experienced as a mildly inconvenient scavenger game represented, on the other end, someone's entire livelihood and entire legal exposure rolled into one freezing errand. The recruitment advertisements themselves rarely mentioned drugs directly, at least not in the opening lines. They read like any other gig posting: flexible schedule, work in your own neighbourhood, payment upon completion of simple tasks, no experience necessary. Only after a curious applicant expressed interest would the actual nature of the work reveal itself, gradually one message at a time, by which point the applicant had often already invested enough curiosity or desperation to keep asking questions rather than simply walking away. It's a recruitment funnel that would look uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has studied how other exploitative industries quietly draw in people who never intended to end up where they eventually land. What makes this particular role so quietly tragic is how invisible it remained to the very system exploiting it. Buyers rarely thought about the person who buried their package. Sellers treated couriers as an easily replaceable input, one more line item in an operational budget. And law enforcement, when it did make arrests, tended to catch precisely these couriers rather than the operators safely behind their screens, meaning the people who bore nearly all the physical risk also bore nearly all the legal consequence, while the architects of the entire system remained comfortably, infuriatingly out of reach. Let's sit with the grim reality of the courier's day, because it strips away any glamour this story might have accidentally acquired. Imagine trudging through a Russian winter, temperatures well below freezing, clutching a bag of items that could send you to prison for years, searching for hiding spots that are hidden enough to avoid honest passers-by, but findable enough for a stranger you'll never meet. Every stranger might be a police officer. Every security camera is a witness. And the pay, once you factor in the constant terror and the very real chance of arrest, was rarely worth it. Researchers found that courier costs made up an enormous chunk of the final price, sometimes more than half. The treasure hunt, it turned out, was expensive precisely because someone always had to freeze for it. Consider the sheer physical toll of the job before even accounting for the legal risk. Russian winters are not the polite, photogenic snowfalls of a holiday postcard. They are brutal, bone-deep, the kind of cold that turns a simple errand into an endurance test. A courier working a full shift might spend hours outdoors, fingers stiffening around a phone screen trying to photograph a hiding spot for the buyer, breath fogging in front of a face half hidden by a scarf pulled up against both the temperature and the ever-present fear of a security camera catching a clear profile shot. Every single stop on a courier's route carried its own small private calculation of risk. Was that man loitering by the entrance an ordinary resident waiting for a friend, or an officer conducting quiet surveillance? Was that flicker of movement in a parked car innocent, or the beginning of an arrest that would end an entire chapter of someone's life in the space of a few frantic seconds? This constant background calculation, repeated dozens of times across a single shift, produces a very particular kind of exhaustion, one that has nothing to do with physical labour and everything to do with sustained low-grade dread. And here's where the economics turn genuinely bleak. Despite bearing this enormous burden of risk and discomfort, couriers often received a relatively small cut of the final transaction price. Researchers digging into the actual cost structure of platforms like Hydra discovered that delivery expenses, meaning the courier's payment, ate up a startling percentage of what buyers ultimately paid, in some cases more than half the total price of a single dead drop. The person taking on nearly all the physical danger was, in a cruel twist of gig economy logic, often the least protected and least compensated part of the entire operation. Think about the sheer unglamorous logistics of it. Layers of cheap clothing that never quite kept the cold out. A phone battery drained faster than usual by the effort of photographing hiding spots in freezing temperatures. Gloves thin enough to still operate a touchscreen but never thin enough to prevent numb, clumsy fingers by the second hour. There was no equipment budget, no employer-provided gear, no warm van to retreat to between stops. Just a person, a bag, and a city that seemed determined to make every single delivery as physically miserable as possible, on top of everything already terrifying about the legal risk involved. There's a particular kind of dark irony sitting at the centre of all this. Every convenience the buyer enjoyed, the ease of ordering from a warm apartment, the simplicity of walking to a nearby hiding spot rather than negotiating with a stranger, was purchased at the cost of someone else's frozen, frightened hours spent outdoors doing the actual dangerous work. The entire system was engineered to make the experience frictionless for the customer, while quietly transferring every ounce of that removed friction onto the shoulders of the person standing in the snow, doing the one part of the job that technology could never fully remove from the equation. None of this could have worked without the other great enabler of the era, cryptocurrency. Payments on Hydra weren't made in cash or card, which leave trails as obvious as muddy boots on a white carpet. Instead, buyers paid using digital currencies designed to be difficult to trace, moving value across the internet without a bank in the middle, asking polite but pointed questions. This is the part that made the whole invisible economy financially possible. Money that could change hands without either hand being seen. Combine untraceable payment with untraceable delivery and untraceable communication, and you've built something that governments genuinely struggle to grab hold of. It was like trying to arrest a rumour. Traditional banking systems exist, in part, as an enormous surveillance apparatus, however politely we usually phrase that. Every transfer, every deposit, every withdrawal leaves a digital footprint that financial institutions are legally required to monitor and report if anything looks suspicious. This infrastructure evolved specifically to make illegal financial activity difficult to conduct at scale. For decades, it worked reasonably well against traditional drug trafficking, forcing criminal enterprises into cash economies, laundering schemes, and the kind of physical money moving that inevitably creates opportunities for law enforcement to intervene. Cryptocurrency didn't just sidestep this system, it rendered much of it functionally irrelevant for a certain category of transaction. A buyer could convert ordinary money into digital currency through various exchanges, sometimes with only modest effort to obscure the trail, and then send that currency directly to a marketplace without any bank ever seeing, understanding, or flagging what the payment was actually for. The transaction existed on a public ledger, technically visible to anyone who cared to look, but decoded into a string of characters utterly meaningless, without the specific technical expertise to trace ownership back to a real person. This technological shift arrived at almost exactly the moment the dead drop delivery model was maturing, and the combination proved devastatingly effective. Where earlier criminal enterprises had to solve the problem of moving physical cash without detection, a genuinely difficult and dangerous logistical challenge, this new generation of operators simply didn't have that problem at all. Money moved instantly, digitally, and largely invisibly, freeing up enormous amounts of operational energy that had previously been consumed by the unglamorous business of laundering physical currency. There were even dedicated services within this ecosystem whose entire purpose was further obscuring the origin of funds, mixing a buyer's digital currency together with thousands of other transactions until untangling any single payment back to its original source became a genuinely difficult technical puzzle. This laundering step, once a labour-intensive, dangerous physical process involving suitcases of cash and complicit accountants, had been reduced to a few clicks and a modest service fee. The entire financial backbone of a massive criminal enterprise had in effect been automated, requiring no trusted human intermediary at any point in the chain. What emerges from this combination is something close to a perfect storm for regulators and law enforcement alike. Untraceable delivery meant no physical handoff to intercept. Untraceable payment meant no financial trail to follow. Encrypted communication meant no easily wiretapped conversations to build a case around. Each individual piece of this puzzle had existed in some form before, but never all together, never this seamlessly integrated into a single functioning platform. Hydra didn't just sell drugs. It sold an entire model of invisible commerce, and cryptocurrency was the quiet technical linchpin holding the whole apparatus together, humming along in the background of every single transaction, entirely unnoticed by the people it was actually protecting. Nobody thanks the plumbing until the pipes stop working, and by the time investigators finally understood exactly how these particular pipes were built, the water had already been flowing for years, quietly filling an entire underground reservoir nobody outside a handful of researchers had even known existed. At this point you might be picturing a niche operation, a shadowy little corner of the internet. Let go of that picture entirely, because the numbers are almost cartoonish. By the end, Hydra reportedly reached the majority of Russia's population geographically, covering an estimated 69% of the country. American officials later claimed it had processed over $5 billion in transactions across its lifetime. In one single year, it was said to account for around 80% of all darknet cryptocurrency activity on the entire planet. Not in Russia, on the planet. A hidden website most people had never heard of had quietly become the largest marketplace of its kind that had ever existed. And it did this in near total silence. Let's try to make these numbers feel real for a moment, because abstract statistics have a way of sliding past without landing properly. Covering 69% of Russia's population geographically means that for the overwhelming majority of people living across a country spanning 11 time zones, from dense western cities to remote eastern outposts, this marketplace was theoretically reachable, its network of couriers and hiding spots extending into corners of the country that most outside observers assumed remained untouched by anything so organized. This wasn't a big city phenomenon confined to Moscow or St. Petersburg. It was a nationwide infrastructure, quietly humming beneath the surface of ordinary life almost everywhere. $5 billion is a genuinely difficult figure to hold in your head properly. It's comparable to the annual revenue of a mid-sized public corporation, the kind of company with headquarters, shareholders, and quarterly earnings calls. Except this revenue accumulated through an operation with no physical headquarters, no public shareholders, and certainly no earnings calls, just an encrypted website and an army of anonymous couriers moving product through buried packages across an entire continent-spanning country. And then there's the darknet market share figure, which might be the most staggering of all. For a single platform operating primarily in one language, serving primarily one country's population, to account for something like 80% of all cryptocurrency transactions across every darknet marketplace globally in a given year, is a statement about scale that borders on the absurd. It suggests that whatever was happening on Western darknet markets, all the platforms most people have actually heard of through news coverage, represented a comparatively small fraction of the total global activity happening in this shadowy corner of commerce. Try comparing this to something more tangible. $5 billion sits comfortably in the same neighborhood as the annual revenue of a well-known international airline or a major national retail chain with stores in every large city. Except that revenue was generated with no physical storefronts, no annual reports, and no shareholders attending quarterly meetings, just an encrypted website and an underground army of couriers moving product hand to buried hand across 11 time zones. When a number that size accumulates in near total silence, it says something uncomfortable about exactly how much economic activity can hide beneath the surface of ordinary life without most people ever noticing it's there. What all these numbers add up to is a simple, uncomfortable truth. An enormous, sophisticated, deeply embedded criminal economy operated for years at a scale most people, even reasonably well-informed people, had absolutely no idea existed. It grew not through dramatic headlines or public notoriety, but through the quiet, compounding effect of convenience, low prices, and a delivery system engineered specifically to stay invisible. By the time anyone outside a small circle of researchers and investigators fully grasped what Hydra had become, it had already spent years quietly becoming the largest marketplace of its exact kind that the world had ever seen. Some records get set with parades. This one got set in near total silence, which somehow made it more unsettling, not less, a quiet reminder that the biggest things are not always the loudest. Here's a question that haunts this whole saga. How did something this enormous survive for 7 whole years? Marketplaces in the West typically got hunted down and destroyed within months, yet Russian law enforcement, by most accounts, made surprisingly little effort to kill Hydra itself. They arrested plenty of couriers, those poor frozen kids left holding the treasure, but the platform at the top kept humming along undisturbed. Researchers and journalists have debated why for years, and no one can say for certain. What's undeniable is the result. Left alone, the market didn't stay small. It grew into a giant, Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to a monster is simply nothing at all. Compare this pattern to how Western darknet marketplaces typically meet their end. A platform emerges, gains notoriety, attracts increasing law enforcement attention as its user base grows large enough to draw headlines, and within a relatively short window, often less than a year, coordinated international operations shut it down, seize its servers, and arrest key operators. This cycle has repeated itself dozens of times across different platforms, different countries, and different eras of internet history, forming an almost predictable rhythm of rise and inevitable fall. Hydra broke this rhythm entirely, surviving not months but years, growing not despite scrutiny, but seemingly in the near absence of any serious domestic effort to dismantle it. Low-level arrests of couriers continued steadily throughout Hydra's existence, providing a visible sense of ongoing enforcement activity. Arrests that made for tidy local news segments about police cracking down on drug distribution. But these arrests, however numerous, targeted only the most replaceable, most visible layer of the operation, leaving the actual platform, its servers, its operators, and its core infrastructure entirely untouched year after year. The reasons behind this pattern remain genuinely murky, and reasonable observers disagree on exactly why. Some point to simple resource limitations, arguing that Russian law enforcement, stretched across an enormous territory and countless competing priorities, simply lack the specialized technical capacity to unravel a sophisticated encrypted platform. Others note, more pointedly, that the matter had reportedly been discussed even within Russia's own parliament, without triggering any serious coordinated crackdown, suggesting the absence of action was at minimum a known and tolerated state of affairs rather than a simple oversight. Local news segments throughout this period regularly reported drug arrests, and on paper this created the comforting impression of an active, engaged enforcement effort. Look closer though, and a pattern emerges. The vast majority of these arrests involved couriers caught mid-delivery, or small-time street users caught with modest personal quantities, rarely anyone connected meaningfully to the platform's actual technical or financial infrastructure. It's a bit like celebrating a crackdown on litter while leaving the factory that manufactured the litter running at full capacity just down the road. The visible enforcement theatre and the actual underlying business operated for years on almost entirely separate tracks. Whatever the true explanation, the practical result speaks for itself. Left largely undisturbed at its core for the better part of a decade, Hydra had the rare luxury that almost no other criminal marketplace in history has ever enjoyed. Time. Time to refine its systems, build trust with its user base, absorb its competitors, and grow into something far larger and more entrenched than it ever could have become under the kind of sustained pressure that eventually crushes most platforms of its kind within a single calendar year. Sometimes the absence of a fight is its own kind of story, and this was very much one of those times. Silence, it turns out, can be just as consequential as any headline-grabbing raid. Quietly buying an entire criminal ecosystem exactly the kind of time money can't purchase. The kind that lets a small operation quietly mature into something considerably harder to ever fully dismantle. Let's step away from the machinery and into the lives it consumed, because behind every transaction was a person, and many of those people were not okay. Heavy users of the strongest cathinones earned a grim nickname, and the descriptions of their lives are bleak, intensely paranoid, deeply antisocial, isolated, suspicious of everyone, often unwilling to seek any help at all. These weren't the sociable, chatty users of older party drugs. The powders rewired something. People vanished into apartments, into binges, into a loop of chasing a high that burned out faster than it arrived. Whole communities watched neighbours and children disappear behind locked doors, present in body but gone in every other way that mattered. The paranoia associated with heavy use of the strongest of these stimulants was reportedly severe enough to fundamentally reshape how a person interacted with the world around them. Ordinary interactions, a knock at the door, a stranger's glance on the street, a phone that rang unexpectedly, could trigger overwhelming waves of suspicion entirely disproportionate to any actual threat. Over time, this constant defensive posture wore down a person's ability to maintain relationships, hold employment, or even step outside their own front door without significant distress, gradually narrowing an entire life down to the four walls of a single room and the small familiar rituals of preparing another dose. This social withdrawal created a particular kind of tragedy that differed meaningfully from earlier drug epidemics. Previous waves of substance abuse, while certainly devastating, often unfolded at least partially in public view, visible to neighbours, co-workers, and extended family in a way that allowed communities to respond, however imperfectly, with intervention or support. This new pattern of use pushed people inward instead, into private, hidden binges that could stretch for days without anyone outside a small circle even realizing anything was wrong. The isolation wasn't incidental. It was, in a very real sense, baked directly into the pharmacology of what people were consuming. Health workers and addiction specialists who encountered these users described a population reluctant, sometimes fiercely resistant to seeking any kind of help. Part of this reluctance stemmed from the genuine paranoia the drugs themselves induced, making the idea of trusting a doctor, a counsellor, or even a support hotline feel like an unbearable risk rather than a lifeline. Part of it stemmed from the simple stigma surrounding drug use in general, a stigma that discourages people from admitting a problem exists long after that problem has already consumed enormous portions of their daily life. Workers at the few charities willing to engage with this population described a particular hollowed-out quality to heavy users, a wariness in the eyes, a reluctance to make eye contact at all, that set them apart even from people struggling with more familiar substances. The nickname given to this group carried a certain grim resignation in how casually it was used, the way any subculture eventually develops shorthand for its most extreme members. But behind the shorthand sat real people, often once talkative, once employed, once embedded in ordinary family life, who had gradually narrowed their entire existence down to a locked door, a dwindling supply, and a creeping certainty that everyone outside that door meant them harm. What emerges from all this is a portrait of an epidemic that operated almost entirely out of public view, hidden not by conspiracy, but by the very nature of the substance itself, which seemed almost purpose-built to keep its users isolated, suspicious, and disconnected from exactly the kind of community support that might otherwise have caught the problem earlier. Communities didn't fail to notice because they didn't care. They failed to notice because the drug had quietly rewritten the terms of visibility itself, hollowing people out from the inside while leaving the outside for a surprisingly long time, looking almost entirely undisturbed. We should talk plainly about why these substances were so destructive, because the harm wasn't abstract. Doctors treating users described a grim catalogue of effects: crushing anxiety, panic attacks, sleeplessness that stretched for days, aggression, and a kind of unravelling of the nervous system itself. Unlike a plant that grows the same way every season, these lab-made powders varied wildly in strength and contents from batch to batch, so nobody, not even the seller, truly knew what any given package would do to a given body. The unpredictability was the danger. You weren't taking a known risk, you were taking a mystery over and over, and hoping the mystery stayed kind. It frequently did not. Consider what it means, medically, for a substance to be genuinely unpredictable in this way. When you buy a bottle of wine, however cheap, you have some reasonable expectation of its alcohol content, because production is regulated and standardized enough to guarantee a baseline of consistency. These synthetic stimulants offered no such guarantee. 2 packages sold under the exact same street name, purchased from the exact same vendor a week apart, might contain meaningfully different chemical compositions, different concentrations, or entirely different cathinone variants altogether, depending on whatever ingredients happened to be available to whichever underground chemist produced that particular batch. This variability transformed every single use into something closer to a chemistry experiment performed on one's own nervous system. A dose that produced a manageable, even pleasant stimulant effect one week might produce overwhelming cardiac strain or psychological distress the next, not because the user had changed anything about how they consumed it, but because the product itself had quietly changed underneath them. Doctors treating emergency cases described patients arriving with wildly inconsistent symptoms, sometimes purely psychological, sometimes dangerously physical, making diagnosis and treatment considerably more complicated than dealing with a known, standardized substance. The psychological toll deserves particular attention because it extended well beyond the immediate high into something far more corrosive over time. Repeated use was linked to persistent anxiety that lingered long after any single dose had worn off, a kind of chemical residue that colonized the user's baseline emotional state rather than simply spiking and receding. Sleep, often already fragile in people dealing with the broader hardships of their circumstances, deteriorated further, sometimes vanishing entirely for days at a stretch during heavy binges, leaving users exhausted, irritable, and increasingly disconnected from any stable rhythm of ordinary life. Emergency room physicians treating these cases faced a genuinely maddening diagnostic puzzle. A patient might arrive with a racing heart, dilated pupils, and severe agitation, symptoms that could point toward a dozen different possible causes, and standard drug screening tests designed to catch more established substances like cocaine or amphetamines frequently fail to identify the specific synthetic cathinone actually responsible. Treatment in practice often became a matter of managing symptoms as they appeared, rather than targeting a known cause, a considerably less precise and more anxious way to practice medicine than doctors would ever prefer, especially when the patient's condition could shift rapidly and unpredictably within the same visit. What makes this particular category of harm so quietly insidious is how it defied simple explanation or easy public health messaging. You cannot warn people effectively against a specific danger when the danger itself keeps shifting shape from batch to batch, from lab to lab, from an anonymous chemist's improvised recipe to the next. Every purchase was, in the most literal sense, a gamble with unknown odds, stacked against a user who had no reliable way of knowing, until the effects arrived, exactly what kind of night they had just signed themselves up for. There was no house rule explaining the odds, and no dealer honest enough to post them, which meant every single dose doubled as its own tiny, unwilling experiment, run by an amateur chemist on a stranger who never signed up to be tested on. For every user lost to the powder, there was a family left to make sense of the wreckage, and their stories are the ones history usually forgets. Parents who found strange map coordinates on their teenager's phone, siblings who noticed the paranoia creeping in, mothers who learned an entirely new vocabulary of slang just to understand what was happening to their own children. The dead drop system made it all so quiet, so invisible, that families often had no idea until things were already dire. There was no dealer to confront, no corner to avoid, The danger arrived through a screen and vanished under a paving stone, leaving the people who loved these users grasping at shadows and coordinates they couldn't decode. Imagine the particular disorientation of a parent stumbling across a string of unfamiliar coordinates saved in a phone's notes app, or a browser history full of unfamiliar terms that mean nothing until, with growing dread, a bit of searching reveals their meaning. There was no dramatic confrontation to have, no shady figure to warn away from the front steps, no physical evidence beyond a small plastic bag that could just as easily have been mistaken for something innocent. The entire apparatus of concern that families had historically relied upon, watching for suspicious visitors, recognizing a known dealer loitering nearby, simply didn't apply to a system engineered from the ground up to leave no visible trace at all. This invisibility created a particular kind of anguish for families who eventually did piece together what was happening. There was no clear moment of discovery to point to, no single dramatic intervention that could have changed everything if only it had happened sooner. Instead, families often described a slow, creeping realization, small behavioral changes accumulating over weeks or months, a withdrawal here, an unexplained absence there, until the pattern became undeniable, by which point the person at the centre of it had often already slipped quite far from the family's reach. Learning the vocabulary itself became its own strange burden. Parents who had never encountered terms describing hidden packages or buried treasure found themselves suddenly needing to understand an entire coded language, deciphering slang from a subculture they'd had no reason to know existed until it arrived, uninvited, inside their own household. This linguistic gap widened the emotional distance between generations even further, as parents scrambled to catch up to a reality their children had already been quietly living inside for some time. Consider the particular loneliness of a parent trying to explain the situation to relatives who grew up with an entirely different, more visible model of addiction, one involving needle marks or slurred speech, or the unmistakable smell of alcohol on a returning teenager's breath. This new danger offered none of those familiar cues. A son or daughter could seem perfectly ordinary at the dinner table, only to retreat afterward into a private world of coordinates and buried packages that left no obvious physical trace for a worried parent to point to. Explaining this to grandparents, to neighbours, to anyone raised on an older vocabulary of concern often felt like describing a threat from a different planet entirely. What makes these family stories so worth pausing on, even briefly, is how completely they upend the traditional image of drug intervention. There was no corner to avoid walking past, no known house to steer a wayward teenager clear of, no dealer whose face could be reported to a concerned neighbour. The danger had gone fully digital and fully buried, leaving families to fight an enemy they often couldn't even properly see, armed with nothing but fragments of coordinates, and a sinking, growing sense that something had gone quietly, invisibly wrong. Grief, in this new shape, had learned to move as quietly as the crime that caused it, arriving in a household without ever once knocking on the door first. Perhaps the most chilling detail of the entire era is how young some of the people caught up in it were. Harm reduction workers noted that many of those drawn into buying these new synthetic stimulants were the youngest users, teenagers and schoolchildren, precisely the group most likely to be curious, most likely to be broke, and most likely to be recruited as couriers for a bit of quick cash. The frictionless, app-like ease of the system lowered every barrier that had once slowed a young person down. There was no intimidating dealer to approach, no dark alley to summon courage for. There was just a website and a map. Convenience, it turns out, is a wonderful thing right up until it isn't. Think about what actually stops a curious teenager from experimenting with something dangerous in the old face-to-face system of buying drugs. Part of it is simple intimidation. the discomfort of approaching an unfamiliar, often unsavory adult stranger, negotiating in person for something illegal, and risking the kind of exposure that comes with being seen in the wrong place at the wrong time. This friction, uncomfortable as it was for everyone, also functioned as an accidental safeguard, discouraging plenty of curious but cautious young people from ever taking that first difficult step. The online dead drop model dissolved nearly all of that friction. A curious teenager with a smartphone and a small amount of pocket money could browse a marketplace from the privacy of their own bedroom, place an order with a few taps, and walk to a nearby hiding spot without ever having to look another human being in the eye or explain themselves to anyone. The entire experience mirrored the exact convenience of any other app-based purchase they'd grown up making, and that familiarity, that seamless normalcy, stripped away much of the psychological hesitation that had previously protected younger, more impulsive buyers from themselves. Recruitment into courier work compounded this problem further. Teenagers looking for quick cash, often without fully appreciating the legal severity of what they were agreeing to, found themselves offered exactly the kind of flexible, low-commitment work that appeals to someone still in school, still living at home, still testing the boundaries of independence. The job postings rarely spelled out the full legal risk up front, and by the time a young recruit understood exactly what they'd signed up for, the money, however modest, had often already created a sense of obligation or dependency that made simply walking away feel harder than continuing. Harm reduction outreach workers who spent time in schools and youth centres during this period described a genuinely unsettling shift in the average age of first exposure, with some of the youngest cases involving children barely into their teenage years, already familiar with the basic vocabulary of ordering and retrieving a drop before many of their parents had ever heard the terminology at all. Word spread through school hallways the way any trend spreads among teenagers, through casual mentions, shared screenshots, and the universal adolescent instinct to try whatever the slightly older kids seemed to already know about. The system's ease of access meant this word-of-mouth curiosity could translate into an actual purchase within minutes, with none of the traditional delays that once gave a nervous first-timer time to reconsider. This youth-facing vulnerability represents one of the epidemic's most troubling dimensions, because it suggests the technology didn't merely serve an existing population of drug users more efficiently. It actively expanded that population downward, pulling in young people who, under the older friction-heavy system, might never have taken that first step at all. Convenience, so often celebrated as an unambiguous virtue in modern life, revealed here one of its darkest possible applications, quietly widening the door to an entire generation that the old system's inconvenience had accidentally helped keep out. Some obstacles, it turns out, were doing more good than anyone ever gave them credit for. It would be unfair to paint this era as pure darkness with no light at all. So let's honour the ones who fought back with compassion rather than handcuffs. Across Russia, small and often embattled charities work to reduce the damage, offering information, support and a shred of dignity to people the wider society had written off. Groups dedicated to harm reduction tried to keep users alive long enough to one day recover, distributing knowledge and kindness in a climate that offered little of either. Their work was difficult, underfunded, and sometimes legally precarious. But in a story overflowing with people profiting from suffering, they were the ones quietly trying to subtract from it. That deserves remembering. Harm reduction work anywhere in the world tends to be thankless, chronically underfunded, and viewed with suspicion by segments of the public who see any assistance to drug users as somehow condoning their behaviour, rather than simply trying to keep them alive long enough to have a chance at something better. In Russia, this general difficulty was compounded by a legal and political environment that offered little formal support for this kind of intervention. leaving small, dedicated organizations to operate largely on volunteer energy, private donations, and sheer stubborn persistence in the face of an epidemic that seemed to grow faster than any grassroots response could keep pace with. These organizations did the unglamorous, essential work that rarely made headlines, providing accurate information about the risks of specific substances to people who had no other reliable source of that knowledge, offering testing services where possible to help users at least understand what they were actually consuming, and providing a non-judgmental point of contact for people too frightened or ashamed to seek help through more official channels. In a landscape where formal healthcare systems often treated drug users with suspicion or outright hostility, these small charities frequently represented the only source of care that didn't come wrapped in judgment. The legal precariousness of this work deserves particular acknowledgement. Providing harm reduction services in an environment skeptical of the entire concept meant these organizations often operated in a grey zone themselves, vulnerable to shifting political winds, funding crackdowns, or simple official indifference that could shutter their operations with little warning. Workers within these groups took on their own quiet form of risk, dedicating themselves to a population that society had largely decided to look away from, often with minimal institutional protection or recognition for the genuinely difficult work they were doing. The practical work itself was often deceptively modest in scope. A printed pamphlet describing what to do in the event of an overdose, a quiet phone line staffed by volunteers willing to talk at 3 a.m. without judgment, a small table set up wherever people already gathered, offering clean supplies and a few honest words about risk that no government pamphlet was willing to print. None of it was glamorous, none of it made headlines. But for the individual person who called that phone line on the worst night of their life, or who took the pamphlet home and read it twice before deciding to seek help, that quiet, unglamorous work was the difference between a story that ended in recovery and one that didn't. What makes this thread of the story worth pausing on is the contrast it offers against everything else we've discussed. The profiteers, the couriers exploited for their labour, the platform operators who built an empire on other people's suffering. Amid all of that, a small, persistent countercurrent existed, made up of people trying to do the opposite, trying to reduce harm rather than monetize it, trying to preserve dignity rather than exploit desperation. Their impact may have been modest against the sheer scale of the epidemic, but their presence matters, a quiet reminder that even in the darkest corners of this story, some people were still choosing to help. Every empire has its final morning, and Hydra's came in April of 2022, not from Russian police but from a combined operation by German and American authorities who seized the platform's servers, which happened to be sitting in Germany, along with a stash of cryptocurrency. After 7 years of untouchable dominance, the largest darknet marketplace in the history of the world simply switched off. Millions of accounts gone, an entire underground economy decapitated in a single coordinated strike, which is a poetic fate for something named after a many-headed monster. For a brief moment it looked like the story might finally have a clean ending. Anyone who knows how Hydra's work could have warned them otherwise. The operation itself unfolded with the kind of quiet international coordination that rarely makes for dramatic television, but proves devastatingly effective in practice. Investigators had apparently spent considerable time tracing the platform's technical infrastructure, discovering that despite serving a primarily Russian audience, key servers sat physically within German jurisdiction, an operational choice that had presumably once seemed like a reasonable technical decision, and eventually became the single point of failure that brought the entire structure down. When German and American authorities finally moved, they moved together, seizing not just the servers themselves but a substantial cache of cryptocurrency, reportedly worth tens of millions of dollars, effectively cutting off both the platform's technical existence and a meaningful chunk of its accumulated wealth in one coordinated action. For the millions of registered users who woke up one morning to find their familiar marketplace simply gone, the disruption was immediate and total. There was no gradual decline, no slow fade as competitors chipped away at market share. One day the platform existed as it always had, and the next day it simply didn't, leaving an enormous vacuum where a sophisticated, trusted, years-old commercial infrastructure had stood just hours before. It's difficult to overstate how disorienting this must have been for a user base that had grown genuinely dependent on the platform's reliability, its escrow protections, its established vendor relationships built up over years of accumulated trust. There's a certain grim poetry, worth pausing on, in the platform's own choice of name finally catching up with it in the most literal way imaginable. A creature that grows two heads for every one severed is precisely the wrong metaphor to have chosen if your actual goal is permanent destruction, and the story that followed would prove this etymological irony almost immediately. The takedown was real, complete, and thorough in every technical sense. But taking down a platform and eliminating the underlying demand, the underlying supply chains, and the underlying appetite for exactly this kind of service are three very different accomplishments, and only one of them had actually been achieved that April morning. Behind the scenes, the investigative effort that led to this moment reportedly stretched back years, involving painstaking financial forensics, undercover purchases designed to map vendor networks, and the kind of patient digital detective work that rarely makes for exciting television, but ultimately proves decisive. Investigators had to trace cryptocurrency flows through deliberately obscured wallets, correlate server activity across jurisdictions, and build a case robust enough to justify simultaneous coordinated action across two separate countries' legal systems. None of this happened overnight, and none of it happened by accident. It was the quiet, grinding accumulation of evidence, assembled piece by piece until the picture finally became clear enough to act on decisively. In the immediate aftermath, headlines celebrated a genuine victory, and it was won, against an operation that had grown far larger than most people ever realized existed. But anyone with even passing familiarity with the history of prohibition, or indeed with basic Greek mythology, might have paused before declaring the war over. Some monsters, once decapitated, have an unfortunate habit of growing back considerably more heads than they started with, and this particular monster was about to prove the old story uncomfortably accurate. Here's the uncomfortable truth about killing a monster. The thing that replaces it is often worse, in ways you didn't anticipate. With Hydra gone, its millions of users scattered, many onto encrypted messaging apps, into a chaotic new landscape with none of the old protections. The reliable escrow was gone, the trusted reviews were gone, and into that vacuum poured the scammers, people who would take your payment and simply vanish, offering nothing in return. Users reported that product quality plummeted, and that they no longer knew what was even in the powders they were buying. The orderly, self-regulating giant had been replaced by a lawless free-for-all. Order, even criminal order, turns out to leave a strange and dangerous hole when it goes. Consider what actually disappeared alongside Hydra's servers that April morning, beyond the platform itself. Years of accumulated vendor reputation, painstakingly built through countless individual transactions and reviews, vanished overnight, taking with it the entire trust infrastructure that had made the marketplace feel, however grimly, reliable. Buyers who had come to depend on knowing exactly which vendors delivered quality product and honoured their commitments suddenly found themselves back at square one, forced to rebuild that knowledge from scratch across an entirely new and fragmented landscape of competing, unproven platforms. The migration toward encrypted messaging applications represented a significant step backward in terms of buyer protection, even as it offered criminals a genuinely effective way to continue operating with minimal centralized infrastructure to target. Messaging apps lacked any of the escrow mechanisms that had protected Hydra buyers from outright fraud. There was no neutral third party holding payment until delivery was confirmed, no dispute resolution process to appeal to when a transaction went wrong. It was, in the most literal sense, a return to the trust-based handshake deal vulnerability that Hydra's sophisticated infrastructure had spent years engineering itself away from. Users interviewed in the aftermath described a marketplace suddenly flooded with opportunistic scammers, individuals who had learned just enough about the general system to advertise convincingly, while having no actual product or intention of delivering anything at all. Payment would be sent, promises would be made, and then, with a frequency that apparently increased sharply after Hydra's collapse, nothing would ever arrive. The absence of any enforceable reputation system meant these scammers could operate with near impunity, burning through victim after victim with minimal consequence beyond perhaps losing access to one particular messaging channel before simply opening another. Within days of the shutdown, forum posts and messaging channels lit up with displaced vendors and buyers, frantically trying to relocate their business relationships, sharing usernames and contact handles across whatever platform still seemed reachable and reasonably secure. This scramble happened with none of the careful, gradual trust building that had characterized the original platform's slow rise years earlier. Everyone was simply trying to reconnect as quickly as possible, and that urgency, understandably, created exactly the kind of chaotic, poorly vetted environment where opportunistic fraud could flourish almost immediately, unchecked by any of the reputation systems that had taken years to mature on the platform everyone had just lost. Product quality too reportedly suffered considerably in this new fragmented landscape. Without the kind of centralized platform that had allowed buyers to compare vendor reputations and avoid known bad actors, users found themselves increasingly uncertain about the actual composition of whatever they were purchasing, a genuinely dangerous development given how much the safety of these substances already depended on knowing roughly what you were consuming. The takedown had successfully destroyed a particular criminal enterprise. It had done considerably less to protect the people who had depended on that enterprise, however grim the irony, for whatever small measure of safety its systems had once provided. Removing the roof doesn't always shelter the people standing underneath it, a lesson that arrived for many former users considerably too late to matter. Cut off one head, grow two. Remember, within months of Hydra's death, the void didn't stay empty for long. Analysts watched a dozen new Russian-language marketplaces burst into existence, competing to inherit the throne, and collectively they quickly surpassed the volume Hydra had been handling. Researchers borrowed a phrase from evolutionary history and called it a Cambrian explosion, that ancient moment when life suddenly diversified into 1,000 strange new forms. The dead drop model, the reviews, the escrow, the whole grim apparatus simply respawned across new platforms, some louder, some sketchier, all hungry. The lesson was brutal and clear. You can destroy a marketplace. Destroying the idea of one is a very different matter. The speed of this recovery deserves genuine attention because it undermines any comfortable assumption that a major takedown permanently solves the underlying problem. Within a matter of months, not years, a dozen distinct platforms had emerged, each attempting to capture the orphaned user base that Hydra's collapse had scattered across the digital landscape. This wasn't a slow, hesitant rebuilding process. It was closer to a stampede, driven by operators who understood, correctly as it turned out, that enormous unmet demand doesn't simply evaporate because its previous supplier disappeared. What's particularly striking is that these new platforms didn't need to reinvent anything fundamental. The entire operational blueprint, the dead drop delivery method, the escrow protections, the review and reputation systems, had already been proven at massive scale by Hydra itself. New operators simply copied this working template wholesale, saving themselves years of trial and error that the original pioneers had needed to work through. It's a bit like watching a successful restaurant chain go out of business, only to see a dozen nearly identical restaurants open in its place within months, each one having learned exactly what worked from watching the original succeed. Within roughly 5 months of Hydra's shutdown, researchers found that this new collection of competing marketplaces had collectively handled more volume than Hydra itself had processed during a comparable early period of its own existence. This wasn't recovery. It was, in raw commercial terms, an acceleration, suggesting that the underlying market had actually grown during the disruption rather than shrinking, as displaced users and vendors alike scrambled to re-establish themselves across whichever new platform seemed most likely to survive and thrive. One successor platform in particular, widely anticipated within these online communities and openly discussed as the heir apparent long before it fully launched, was even framed by its own users as the natural continuation of everything the fallen giant had built. This wasn't a quiet, humble rebuilding effort conducted in the shadows. It was closer to a public coronation, complete with community anticipation and open speculation about which platform would ultimately consolidate the fractured market back into something resembling the old order. The language people used to describe this process of succession, of inheritance, of a rightful heir stepping up, reveals just how thoroughly institutionalized this entire criminal ecosystem had become in the public imagination of its own users. The evolutionary metaphor researchers reached for turns out to be uncomfortably apt. Just as a mass extinction event in the natural world doesn't end life, but rather clears ecological niches for rapid, explosive diversification among survivors, Hydra's removal didn't end the underlying demand for exactly the kind of service it had provided. It simply cleared space for a dozen competitors to rush in and fill that space simultaneously, each one a slightly different variation on the same successful blueprint. The monster's head had been cut off cleanly and completely. The body, it turned out, had already learned how to grow several replacements at once, apparently having read the same mythology everyone else had, and taken careful notes on how the story was supposed to go, right down to the part where cutting off one head was never actually the ending. For a story this vast, you'd expect a dramatic villain, and eventually the courts produced one. In December of 2024, a Russian court sentenced a man identified as Hydra's operator to life in prison, with 15 associates receiving sentences ranging from 8 to 23 years. After all the encryption, all the anonymity, all the untraceable money and invisible deliveries, the person at the very top still ended up in a very traceable prison cell. It's a reminder that no matter how clever the technology, these enterprises are ultimately run by people, and people, unlike websites, cannot be relaunched under a new name. The many-headed monster, it turned out, did have one head that mattered after all. The path from the platform's April 2022 shutdown to this eventual courtroom outcome took considerable time, reflecting the genuine complexity of untangling an operation that had spent years deliberately obscuring the identities behind it. Every layer of encryption, every anonymizing technique, every carefully compartmentalized piece of the operation that had made Hydra so resistant to law enforcement during its active years also made it genuinely difficult to build a prosecutable case once the servers themselves had finally been seized. investigators had to work backward through years of accumulated digital evidence, financial trails, and operational records to eventually piece together who had actually been directing the enterprise from behind its wall of anonymity. The severity of the sentences handed down reflects the scale of what prosecutors had ultimately proven. A life sentence for the primary operator, alongside substantial prison terms ranging from 8 to 23 years for 15 associates, signals that this wasn't treated as a minor drug distribution case, but as the dismantling of what amounted to a sprawling criminal enterprise, one that had generated billions in transactions and touched, in one way or another, a meaningful portion of an entire nation's population over the course of nearly a decade. There's something almost instructive in how long this legal process ultimately took, roughly 2.5 years between the platform's technical shutdown and its operator's final sentencing. It illustrates the genuine asymmetry between how quickly technology can be dismantled and how slowly justice, particularly justice built on unraveling deliberately obscured criminal networks, actually moves. The servers went dark in an instant. The human accountability that followed took years of patient, methodical investigative work to finally arrive at a courtroom. The trial itself reportedly unfolded away from the kind of intense public spectacle that might have accompanied a similarly enormous case in a Western courtroom, a quiet, almost bureaucratic conclusion to a saga that had spent years generating international headlines every time researchers published a new estimate of its staggering scale. There was no dramatic press conference, no perp walk broadcast to a waiting public, just a verdict and a set of sentences handed down, closing the book on an enterprise that had once seemed almost too large and too well protected to ever fully account for. The quiet ending felt, in its own way, oddly fitting for a business that had spent its entire existence trying not to be noticed. What this final chapter offers, more than anything, is a useful corrective to the almost mythological aura that had built up around Hydra during its years of operation, the sense that its operators had built something so technically sophisticated it existed almost beyond the reach of consequence. In the end, technology provided cover, delay, and genuine difficulty for investigators, but it didn't provide permanent immunity. Behind every encrypted marketplace, however sophisticated, sits an actual human being who eventually has to answer in an actual courtroom for the actual consequences of what they built. The many-headed monster of mythology proved unkillable. This particular monster, it turned out, still had exactly one neck that mattered, and the courts eventually found it. To appreciate just how unusual Russia's system was, it helps to glance westward at how the rest of the world did things. In the United States and Western Europe, the famous darknet markets, the ones with names people actually recognized, mostly relied on the humble postal system, mailing disguised packages across cities and borders. No frozen couriers, no buried treasure, no map coordinates. The Russian model, born from that backfired postal inspection law, evolved down a completely separate path, developing its own peculiar customs, its own slang, its own logistics. Two parallel underworlds barely interacting, solving the same problem in wildly different ways. It's a genuine case study in how a single local law can send an entire industry evolving in an entirely new direction. Western darknet markets, the platforms that occasionally made international headlines when authorities finally took them down, operated on a fundamentally different logistical model from the very beginning. Vendors packaged their products, often disguised inside innocuous everyday items, and simply mailed them through ordinary postal and courier services, sometimes across entire continents. This approach relied on the sheer overwhelming volume of legitimate mail that postal services process daily, betting, usually correctly, that any individual package stood a reasonable chance of slipping through without inspection amid millions of others moving through the same system. This mail-based model came with its own distinct set of risks and advantages compared to Russia's dead drop approach. International shipments could be intercepted at customs checkpoints, creating a genuine choke point where law enforcement occasionally scored significant seizures. But successful shipments could also travel enormous distances with a single transaction, connecting a producer in one country directly to a buyer in another without requiring the dense local network of couriers that Russia's dead drop system absolutely depended on. It was a model built for global reach rather than local density. Russia's postal inspection law essentially closed off this option, forcing an entirely separate evolutionary path to develop in isolation from its Western counterparts. Without the option of mailing packages directly to buyers, the Russian ecosystem had no choice but to develop hyperlocal solutions, an entire dense network of couriers physically present in every city, capable of hiding and documenting drop locations that buyers could retrieve on foot within their own neighborhood. This wasn't a superior or inferior solution to the Western model. It was simply a different answer to the same underlying problem, shaped entirely by the specific legal environment that had forced its development. Think of the handful of Western platforms that occasionally broke through into mainstream news coverage over the years, each one eventually toppled within a relatively short window after reaching real prominence, their operators typically arrested within a year or two of achieving significant scale. These platforms captured public imagination precisely because their rise and fall followed a dramatic, almost cinematic arc. Rapid growth, growing notoriety, and an eventual takedown that made for a satisfying news story, with a clear beginning, middle, and end. Russia's ecosystem offered no such tidy narrative arc for most of its existence, quietly outlasting nearly every one of its more famous Western counterparts combined. What makes this comparison genuinely fascinating is how little interaction existed between these two parallel criminal ecosystems, despite both operating in the same broader technological era and often relying on similar underlying tools like cryptocurrency and anonymizing software. Different languages, different customer bases, and entirely different logistical philosophies meant these two darknet worlds developed almost independently of one another, like two separate branches of evolution responding to different environmental pressures and arriving, eventually, at two entirely different solutions to essentially the same commercial problem. Crime, much like nature, rarely bothers checking what the neighbouring ecosystem is doing. Content to solve its own local problems in its own local, peculiar way, evolving its own dialect of the same fundamental crime entirely undisturbed by what the rest of the world happened to be doing at the same time. So, here we are, at the end of the treasure hunt, and it's worth taking a slow breath before we let this one go entirely. Tonight we walk through a story that started with something as small and unremarkable as a chemistry formula, gathering dust in an old journal, and ended with a courtroom sentence handed down decades later, an entire empire of buried packages and encrypted servers finally, quietly, called to account. In between, we watched a broken, exhausted country reach for something cheap and bright, watched a well-meaning law accidentally invent an entirely new criminal architecture, and watched a website grow so large it briefly became, by some measures, the biggest marketplace of its kind that had ever existed anywhere on the planet. It is, when you lay it all out like that, one of the strangest stories this channel has ever told you at bedtime, and that is really saying something at this point. Think back for a moment over the sheer distance this story travelled. A British nightclub trend, born from a dusty academic footnote nobody had bothered reading in decades. A postal inspection law, written with the best of intentions, that somehow handed an entire industry the blueprint for something far harder to catch. A treasure hunt delivery system that turned an ordinary courtyard into a hiding place, and an ordinary evening walk into a small private transaction nobody else could see. A website that quietly grew larger than almost anyone imagined, complete with reviews and reputations and customer service, dressed in every familiar convenience of modern shopping, except aimed at something that could quietly take a person apart from the inside. And then, after 7 long years, a single coordinated morning when the server simply went dark, only for the whole strange machine to grow back almost immediately, exactly the way its own name warned everyone it would. What makes this particular story linger, though, isn't the scale of it, or even the sheer improbability of an entire nation's drug trade quietly reorganizing itself around buried treasure in the snow. It's the people. It's the parents who found strange coordinates saved in a phone and had to teach themselves an entirely new vocabulary of grief overnight. It's the young couriers, cold and frightened and usually far too young to fully understand what they'd agreed to, trudging through freezing courtyards for money that never came close to covering what it actually cost them. It's the users themselves, isolated behind locked doors, chasing a high that unravelled faster than it arrived, disappearing not with a dramatic collapse but with a slow, quiet fading that their own neighbours often never noticed until it was already far too late. And yet, even inside a story this bleak, there were people who refused to simply look away. The small, underfunded charities handing out honest information nobody else would give. The volunteers staffing a phone line at 3 a.m. for a stranger they'd never meet in person. The investigators who spent years, not weeks, patiently untangling encryption and false identities until an actual human being finally had to answer for what they'd built. None of them made headlines the way the platform itself did. All of them mattered more than the platform ever will. It's worth remembering them specifically by their quiet, unglamorous persistence, because history has a bad habit of remembering only the size of the monster and forgetting entirely about the people who kept showing up anyway, night after night, to work against it. There's something worth sitting with in how ordinary the whole machine looked from the inside too. The reviews read like restaurant feedback. The couriers thought of themselves as gig workers picking up some easy extra cash. The buyers experienced the whole thing as a mildly inconvenient errand rather than anything resembling a moral crossing. That's the quiet, uncomfortable lesson buried underneath all the technology and all the cryptocurrency and all the clever buried packages. Harm rarely announces itself with dramatic music. It just becomes part of the background hum of an ordinary day, folded so seamlessly into daily life that nobody thinks to ask what they're actually looking at until they step back far enough to see the whole strange shape of it. Consider, too, how much of this story turned on decisions that felt small and sensible in the moment they were made. A postal worker asked to glance a little more carefully at parcels, a teenager answering a vague job posting for some quick, flexible cash, a buyer choosing the vendor with slightly better star ratings. None of these were dramatic choices. None of them felt to the person making them like a step into anything particularly momentous. And yet stacked together year after year, they built something that reshaped how an entire country bought and sold its worst habits. That's often how history actually works. Quietly, in 1,000 small decisions rather than one grand villainous plan, and it's worth remembering the next time some new convenience arrives in your life promising to remove just one more small piece of friction. Prohibition, we learned tonight, doesn't erase demand. It just reshapes the path that demand takes to satisfy itself, and sometimes that new path turns out to be considerably stranger, considerably more resilient, and considerably harder to ever fully dismantle than anyone drafting the original law ever imagined. Cut off one head, and the story gave us its own tidy little metaphor for what grew back in its place. That pattern isn't unique to Russia, and it isn't unique to salt. It's a pattern this channel has quietly circled before, in one disguise or another, in nearly every history of medicine and addiction we've ever sat down together to explore. Somewhere, a door closes. Somewhere else, a stranger one quietly swings open instead. So tonight, as you settle into a bed that isn't hidden behind a paving stone, in a home where the biggest danger waiting for you is maybe a slightly too warm blanket, take a moment to feel the plain, unglamorous safety of that. You don't have to decode a stranger's map to find what you need. You don't have to wonder what's actually inside the package, or whether the person who buried it made it home safely afterward. Whatever else tonight's story stirred up in you, curiosity, unease, a strange kind of dark fascination, let it settle now into something calmer. Let it settle into gratitude for the ordinary, undramatic safety of your own evening, for a door that locks from the inside, for a phone that holds nothing more alarming than old messages and forgotten photographs. And if any part of this story landed a little closer to home than you expected, if a fragment of it brushed up against something in your own life or in the life of someone you love, that's all right too. You don't have to carry that alone, and you don't have to sit with it in silence, the way so many of the people in tonight's story were forced to. There are people whose entire job is simply to listen without judgment, the same way there were people in Russia doing exactly that work in the coldest, least forgiving circumstances imaginable. That kind of help exists closer than you think whenever you're ready for it, and reaching for it was never, in any story we've ever told on this channel, a sign of weakness. It was always, quietly, the harder and braver thing to do. Think too about the resilience woven through even the grimmest corners of tonight's story, because it's easy to miss if you're only looking at the scale of the wreckage. A mother who kept asking questions until she finally understood the strange new language her child had learned. A courier who eventually walked away from the job, however late, and chose a different, harder, safer path instead. A city that, in its own quiet way, kept absorbing loss after loss without ever fully giving up on the people it lost. None of these small acts of persistence undo the damage this epidemic caused, but they remind us that even in the coldest, most mechanized version of human suffering, people never entirely stop pushing back against it, one small, unremarkable decision at a time. For now, though, let the night do what night is supposed to do. Let your shoulders drop an inch. Let your breathing slow to something long and unhurried. Somewhere out there, snow is probably still falling on quiet courtyards, settling over places where strange transactions once happened in silence, smoothing the ground back over until there's nothing left to see at all. Let that image be the last thing you carry with you. Not the treasure, not the transaction, just the quiet, patient snow, settling gently over everything, the way sleep is about to settle gently over you. Rest well, and truly rest easy. We'll meet again on the other side of it.